My name is Dorothy Gibson, and I am 72 years old. For 25 years, my son Wesley and his wife Lillian didn't speak a word to me. No phone calls, no birthday cards, no visits at all. That's why, just 2 weeks before Christmas, when I opened my mailbox and saw a handwritten envelope with Wesley's return address in the corner, my hands began to shake. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell me where you're listening from in the comments. I stood there on my porch in the cold Ohio air, staring at it like it might bite me. After 25 years of silence, why now? I took it inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and slowly tore the flap open. The letter was short, just 3 lines. Mom, we would like for you to come spend Christmas with us this year. It would mean a lot to the children. We know you've done well for yourself. We'd love for you to join us. That last line stopped me. We know you've done well for yourself. It wasn't just an invitation. It felt like a test. I must have read those 3 lines a dozen times. The words blurred, but the years of silence didn't. The missed birthdays, the graduations I never saw, the grandchildren I never met, all the years of pretending I didn't exist. And now suddenly they wanted me at their Christmas table. I leaned back in my chair, clutching that piece of paper, and I couldn't help but ask myself, why now? You have to understand where I was coming from. I raised Wesley alone after his father passed away when he was only 7 years old. It was just the 2 of us in a small rented house on the east side of Columbus. I worked long hours at the post office to keep food on the table. I didn't have much to give, but I gave everything I had. When Wesley was in college, he met Lillian. She came from a family with more money, more polish, and I could tell right away she thought I didn't fit into their world. Still, I tried. I showed up to their wedding with a smile, even though I had to sew my own dress to afford being there. I gave them what blessing I could, but things turned sour fast. They asked me to help with a down payment on their first house, and I simply couldn't. I didn't have savings to hand over. When I told them that, the looks they gave me cut like glass. That was the beginning of the silence. Over time, they pulled away completely. Calls went unanswered. Letters returned unopened. The last time I heard Wesley's voice, he told me not to come by anymore because it upset Lillian. And then the door closed for good. 25 years. A quarter of a century. Do you know what that does to a mother? You spend nights staring at the ceiling, wondering what you did so wrong. You stand by the phone during holidays, just hoping to hear their voices. And then one day, you stop waiting. You tell yourself it's done. You force yourself to keep living. That's what I did. I made peace with the idea that I might never see my son again. So now, here it was, all these years later, this invitation sitting on my kitchen table like a ghost from the past. And not just any invitation, an invitation that mentioned money. I made myself a cup of tea and stared at that letter. I tried to imagine what it would be like walking into their home after so long. Would the grandchildren even know who I was? Would they care? Or would I just be a stranger with the same last name? And then there was that line again. We know you've done well for yourself. How did they know? I had lived quietly, never bragging about what I managed to build after those hard years. No new cars in the driveway, no big vacations, no posts on the internet about it. Just steady work, steady savings, and one good investment that changed everything. If they knew about my success, then maybe this wasn't really about family. Maybe it was about something else entirely. I folded the letter back up and slid it into its envelope. My hands didn't stop shaking for hours. That night, I called my friend Nora, the only person I've trusted with my heart through all these years. I read her the letter word for word. She didn't hesitate. Dorothy, she said, you need to go. Not because they deserve it, but because you deserve the closure. But be careful. they wouldn't be writing after 25 years unless they wanted something. Her words echoed in my mind all night long. I lay awake thinking about every Christmas I had spent alone, the frozen dinners I had made for myself, the times I watched neighbors' families gather while I kept my curtains drawn. And now here was an invitation, after all that time, to sit at my own son's table again. It should have felt like a gift. Instead, it felt like a riddle. The next morning, I sat back down at the table with a pen and a piece of plain paper. I wrote 3 words. Yes, I'll come. I folded it neatly, sealed the envelope, and walked it down to the mailbox. As the red flag went up, my chest tightened. For the first time in 25 years, a door was opening again. But I didn't know if I was walking into reconciliation or into something much colder. All I knew was this: the silence was broken. And whatever waited for me on Christmas Day, I had to face it. When I dropped my reply in the mailbox agreeing to come to Christmas, the memories I had pushed away for years started flooding back. I couldn't help but think about how we had even gotten to this place, 25 years apart. I was only 47 when my husband passed away. Wesley was just starting college. Losing his father so suddenly left both of us shaken. I had no choice but to keep going, though. I worked at the post office in Columbus, sorting mail, standing on my feet for hours every day. The pay wasn't much, but it kept us alive. I didn't complain, not once, because I knew my son was watching me. I wanted him to see that even when life knocks you down, you stand back up. Some nights I came home, so tired I could barely lift my arms to cook dinner, but I did it anyway. I told myself that if I could just get him through college, everything would be worth it. Wesley was bright. He studied hard, made friends easily, and seemed to be heading toward a good life. I was proud of him, more proud than I ever let on. I thought the bond we shared was unbreakable. That changed the year he brought Lillian home. She was polite at first, smiling and shaking my hand, but I could tell she was sizing me up. Her family came from a different circle. Her father owned a small business, and her mother was known in their church for being proper. I was a working woman with calloused hands and no savings. From the start, I sensed she thought Wesley marrying me into her family was a step down. I tried to push that thought away. I cooked meals for them when they visited. I saved up for small gifts. I listened to their plans. I wanted to be included, but little by little, they began pulling away. They didn't answer calls right away. They skipped Sunday dinners I used to make. By the time they got married, I already felt like a guest instead of family. Still, I showed up. I found a dress I could afford, altered it myself, and smiled for pictures. I wanted to believe things would settle down. I wanted to believe love was stronger than pride. The breaking point came a year later. They wanted to buy their first house and asked if I could help with the down payment. I was still living paycheck to paycheck, trying to cover my own rent and bills. I had managed to save a small emergency fund, but it was barely enough to keep me afloat if I lost my job. When I explained that I simply didn't have that kind of money, the look Lillian gave me burned deep into my memory. Disappointed wasn't the word. It was disgust. Wesley didn't say much at first, but a week later, he came to see me alone. His words are still clear in my mind. "Mom, you've never given me anything big in my life. This was your chance, and you turned your back." I tried to explain. I told him I gave him everything I could, my time, my energy. Every dollar I earned went toward raising him. But to him, in that moment, none of it counted. Harsh words were exchanged. I told him I would always love him, but I couldn't hand over money I didn't have. He told me maybe it was best if I gave him some space. That space turned into silence. The silence grew deeper over the years. When their first child was born, I found out months later through a neighbor who happened to see the announcement in the paper. There was no phone call, no picture, no invitation to the hospital. When birthdays came, I mailed cards. Sometimes they were returned unopened. Other times they just disappeared into the void. Graduations came and went. High school, then college. I heard through whispers from old church friends that the children were doing well, but I never received an invitation to sit in the stands or clap in the crowd. Each holiday was the hardest. Thanksgiving tables with empty chairs. Christmas mornings where I sat with my coffee, watching snow fall through the window, pretending it didn't hurt that my son and his family were laughing somewhere without me. I watched other families at church, mothers hugging their grown children, being handed grandchildren to cuddle. I learned to keep my face calm, but inside I carried a hollow ache that never went away. There were times I thought about driving to their house just to see them, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to show up uninvited and make things worse. One year I baked a cake for Wesley's birthday, the way I always had when he was little. I wrapped it carefully, drove to their address, and set it on the porch with a note that said, "Love, Mom." I sat in my car for a while, hoping maybe someone would open the door and call me in. No one did. Later that evening, when I drove past again, the cake was gone. I never knew if they ate it or threw it away. After that, I told myself to stop trying. Each attempt only opened the wound deeper. So I buried myself in work and in building a life that didn't depend on their approval. I made friends where I could, leaned on my faith, and reminded myself each morning that I still had purpose. But deep down, the pain never left. A mother doesn't stop loving her child, even when he closes the door. You just learn to carry the weight quietly. And now, 25 years later, with that letter in my hands, all those memories came roaring back. The birthdays, the graduations, the cake on the porch, the silence that followed me everywhere I went. I knew exactly what had separated us. I knew exactly how they had chosen to erase me. And yet, here I was preparing to see them again at Christmas. The estrangement had defined so much of my life. And now I couldn't shake the question, did they really want me back? Or did they just want what they thought I had? When Wesley and Lillian shut me out, I had two choices. I could let the silence swallow me, or I could keep moving forward. At first, I'll admit, I let it crush me. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering why I wasn't enough. But tears don't pay bills, and they don't fix a broken heart. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I went back to work every day at the post office, even when my legs ached and my back begged for rest. I took every extra shift that was offered. I sorted letters in the morning, loaded trucks in the afternoon, and sometimes worked weekends. I told myself if I couldn't be a part of my son's life, I would at least build a life of my own that had some stability. The longer I worked, the more I realized I couldn't depend on a government paycheck forever. Retirement was coming, and my savings were small. So I started looking for ways to improve myself. At 52 years old, I signed up for night classes at the community college. Most people my age were slowing down, but I was carrying notebooks into classrooms filled with 20-year-olds. I studied bookkeeping because I wanted to understand numbers, balance sheets, and how money really worked. I'd come home from the post office, change clothes, and head straight to class. By the time I got home, it would be almost 10 o'clock at night. I'd sit at my kitchen table, working through ledgers and practice problems while drinking coffee just to stay awake. It wasn't easy. My mind wasn't as quick as it had been when I was younger, but I was determined. Every exam I passed, every chapter one finished, felt like reclaiming a little piece of myself. One night after class, I was walking back to my car when one of the younger students asked me why I was pushing myself so hard at my age. I smiled and told her the truth, because nobody's going to take care of me except me. That became my motto. By the time I finished the program, I felt sharper, more confident. I could read financial statements, calculate interest, and understand the risks people take when they borrow money. I wasn't an expert, but I knew enough to make better choices. Around that time, I started hearing people at work talk about side businesses. Some sold crafts at flea markets, some tried their hand at food trucks. I knew I didn't have the energy for something like that, but the idea stuck with me. One afternoon, while running errands, I noticed a small storage facility with a for sale sign posted. It wasn't fancy, just rows of metal units with roll-up doors, surrounded by a chain-link fence. But something about it caught my attention. I went home that night and started running numbers. The property was old, but the demand for storage was steady. People always need a place to put their extra things. With my new bookkeeping skills, I could see how the income and expenses lined up. I didn't jump right away. I spent 3 years saving every spare dollar I could. I cut back on everything, no new clothes, no eating out, no unnecessary spending. I drove my old car until it rattled. Slowly, I built a little nest egg. At 55, I finally had enough for a down payment. I walked into the bank with my paperwork neatly organized in a binder. The loan officer looked at me like I was crazy. A gray-haired postal clerk wanting to buy a storage facility? He asked me twice if I understood what I was getting into. But I had done my homework. I showed him my spreadsheets, my savings record, and the projected cash flow. After weeks of back and forth, the bank approved me. When I signed those papers, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. At first, the business was tough. I managed everything myself, collecting rent, fixing locks, sweeping hallways, even mowing the grass. Some of my co-workers laughed when they found out. Dorothy's out there running storage sheds. They'd say, but I didn't care. Every month, I made sure the bills were paid, and a little was set aside. Slowly, tenants filled the units. The payments were small at first, but steady. It wasn't long before I could hire a handyman to handle the heavier work, and that freed me up to focus on growing. A year later, I refinanced and used the equity to buy a second facility in a nearby town. That one was a little bigger, and I learned from my mistakes the first time around. I set up better locks, painted the doors, and made sure the property looked clean and safe. Before long, word spread. People trusted me. Rent checks started to stack up. Looking back, I think what fueled me wasn't just the need for financial security. It was the need to prove, mostly to myself, that I could build something of value after losing so much. By the time I turned 60, I owned 2 storage businesses that provided steady income every month. I was still frugal, still living in the same modest house, but for the first time in my life, I could breathe. I didn't have to worry about whether the lights would stay on or whether I'd run out of money before the end of the month. Of course, Wesley and Lillian never knew any of this. They never asked. They didn't care to, and I didn't feel the need to broadcast it. What I discovered through those years was that starting over doesn't mean you erase the pain. It means you build something new on top of it. Every extra shift, every late night at school, every penny saved, those weren't just steps toward money. They were steps toward dignity. It took me years, but I learned to carry myself differently. I wasn't the woman waiting by the phone anymore. I was the woman who signed business contracts and paid off loans early. I didn't need Wesley's approval. I had carved out my own path. So when that Christmas letter showed up all those years later, the words, "We know you've done well for yourself," landed heavy, because they were right. I had done well for myself, but not in the way they imagined. It hadn't been luck. It had been grit, long nights, and a refusal to give up. And now, sitting there with that envelope in my hand, I couldn't help but wonder, after 25 years of silence, What exactly did they want from me? Most people thought I was too old to start over, but here I was signing papers on my first business. Do you believe age should stop a woman from building a new life? Subscribe if you think women over 60 still have power, and if you don't, say it in the comments. Let's see how many of you dare. By the time I reached my early 60s, the storage business had grown into more than I ever dreamed. What started with one tired property turned into a small chain. I ended up with 5 facilities scattered between Ohio and Kentucky. None of them were fancy, but the units were full and the rent checks came in on time. The income wasn't flashy, but it was steady. Each month, the deposits covered my bills with plenty left to save. For the first time in my life, I felt the kind of security I had always wanted but never thought I'd have. I didn't have to rely on anyone. I could stand on my own 2 feet. One of the first things I did was buy a little ranch home just outside Columbus. Nothing big, nothing grand. 3 bedrooms, a wide porch, and enough land for a small garden in the back. I paid for it outright, no mortgage. Signing those papers and knowing the house was mine free and clear gave me a peace I can't describe. Friends asked why I didn't move into a bigger house or something closer to the city. But I didn't need that. I didn't need chandeliers or a 3-car garage. What I wanted was a place where I could sit on the porch in the evenings, drink tea, and watch the sun go down without worrying about bills stacking up on the counter. That little house became my safe haven. Even though I finally had money in the bank, I lived much the same way I always had. My car was 10 years old, and I kept it until the wheels just about fell off. I shopped sales at the grocery store, clipped coupons, and mended clothes when I could. I wasn't stingy, but I never saw the point in showing off. I think part of me was afraid that if I started spending big, I'd wake up one day and find it all gone. I had worked too hard to take chances like that. So I stayed careful. When neighbors saw me mowing my own lawn or fixing things around the house, they assumed I was just another retired postal worker living on Social Security. And that was fine with me. Nobody needed to know the details of my finances. I never shared my success with Wesley or Lillian. Truthfully, I didn't even know where they were living anymore. Over the years, I heard bits and pieces through old acquaintances, but they never called. Not once. When people asked about my family, I usually changed the subject. I didn't want to go into the whole painful story. Instead, I poured myself into my work and into the friendships I had built. On Sundays after church, I'd invite a few friends over for pie and coffee. They didn't know the size of my bank account. What mattered was the laughter we shared around the table. That was enough for me. The business kept me busy. I learned to manage tenants, handle repairs, and even negotiate with contractors. Over time, I got good at spotting properties that others overlooked. I'd buy them cheap, fix them up, and rent them out. Some people my age were slowing down, but I was still pushing forward. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it gave me purpose. Running those facilities kept my mind sharp and my heart steady. I wasn't chasing millions. I was building a cushion, so I'd never again have to feel the fear of running out. That was the real fortune I gained, the peace of knowing I could handle whatever came my way. By 65, I could have retired completely, but I didn't. I liked the routine. I liked walking through the rows of units, checking locks, talking to customers who came by to store their belongings. Each one had a story: families moving, young couples downsizing, older folks storing things after losing someone they loved. In a way, it kept me connected to people without needing to lean on family that wasn't there. One afternoon, I was at the bank finalizing paperwork on a loan I was paying off early. The loan officer looked at me and said, "Mrs. Gibson, most people your age are worried about stretching their retirement check. You're sitting here with no debt and more assets than some small companies. How did you do it?" I just smiled and said, 1 month at a time. That was the truth. I didn't have any secrets, no shortcuts, just years of steady work, late nights, and living within my means. It wasn't lost on me that the success came after the hardest heartbreak of my life. I sometimes wondered what Wesley would think if he knew. Would he be proud of me, or would he just see dollar signs? That question stayed with me, but I didn't dwell on it. I had built a life without them, and I wasn't about to go begging for recognition. So when that Christmas letter finally came after 25 silent years, mentioning that they knew I'd done well for myself, it was like the curtain had been pulled back. They didn't suddenly remember me out of love. They remembered me because word of my quiet fortune had reached them somehow. I folded the letter and tucked it into my drawer. My life was full without their approval, but still, I knew I couldn't ignore the invitation. I didn't know what I'd find when I walked into their home again, but I had learned this much over the years. Money might buy security, but it couldn't buy back lost time. I paid for my house in full. No mortgage, no debt. Something I never thought I'd see. If you know how rare that is, share this story so other women know it's possible. After sitting with that letter for a few days, I started to second-guess myself. Did I really want to walk into Wesley and Lillian's home after 25 years? What if the invitation was just a trick to embarrass me, or worse, a way to get money out of me? The thought of seeing them again made my stomach twist. Part of me longed to finally look into my son's eyes and know if he still carried even a shred of love for me. But another part of me worried I'd just find more rejection. I carried those thoughts with me to church the following Sunday. After the service, my friend Nora pulled me aside. She knew I'd received the letter because I had already read it to her over the phone. "Well," she asked, "have you decided?" I shook my head. I don't know if I can walk in there after all this time. She laid a hand on my shoulder. "Dorothy, you need this. Even if they only want something from you, you'll finally know the truth. And knowing is better than wondering the rest of your life." Her words sat heavy with me. She was right. Closure mattered, even if it wasn't pretty. That night, I sat at my dining table and made a list of what I would need if I went. It felt strange, packing for a holiday with family I didn't really know anymore. The first thing on my list was gifts for the grandchildren. I had never met them, but through small bits of information I'd gathered over the years, I knew their names and ages. I went shopping and bought each one something thoughtful, but not extravagant. A book, a warm sweater, a puzzle. I wanted them to have something that showed I thought of them as individuals, not just as strangers. I wrapped each gift carefully and wrote their names in neat handwriting on the tags. Holding those packages made me realize just how many moments I had missed: first steps, birthdays, graduations. I couldn't get those years back, but maybe, just maybe, I could at least let them know I cared. The second thing I packed was an old family photo album. It had pictures of Wesley as a boy, his first day of kindergarten, his high school graduation, vacations we'd taken when money was tight, but laughter was plenty. I hoped the grandchildren might want to see where they came from, the parts of Wesley's life that had been erased when I was cut out. I slipped the album into my bag, telling myself it was more for me than for them. If nobody cared to look at it, at least I would know I had tried to share our history. But then there was the third item, a sealed manila folder I placed at the very bottom of my bag. Inside were legal papers, business records, and property documents. They weren't for show. They were a shield. In my gut, I suspected the mention of "we know you've done well for yourself" in that letter wasn't casual. It sounded like the opening line of a request. If they wanted to test how much money I had, I wanted to be ready. The folder wasn't full of checks or cash. It was full of proof that every bit of what I had built was mine alone. It also contained contracts and conditions I had prepared with the help of a lawyer friend. If Wesley or Lillian thought I'd just hand over money freely, they were mistaken. Packing that folder felt both sad and empowering. Sad, because I shouldn't have to prepare for manipulation from my own son. Empowering, because I refused to walk in unprotected. As the days ticked down toward Christmas, I went back and forth in my mind. Some mornings I thought about canceling, telling myself I didn't owe them anything. Other mornings I felt pulled by something deeper, the need to face them even if it hurt. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror, holding the invitation letter in my hand. I said out loud, "Dorothy, you've survived worse than this. You can face your son." That settled it. I was going. I made small preparations around the house. I baked cookies for Nora, since she'd be checking on things while I was gone. I watered my plants and laid out the clothes I planned to wear. Nothing too formal, just a simple skirt, a warm sweater, and a coat that had lasted me years. I thought about buying something new, but then I shook my head. If they were expecting me to walk in like a showpiece, they'd be disappointed. I was going as myself, plain and steady, the same way I had lived my whole life. The night before I was set to leave, I sat at the table with my packed bag beside me. On top were the neatly wrapped gifts and the photo album. At the bottom, the sealed manila folder rested like a silent anchor. I poured myself a cup of tea and stared at that bag. I thought about the little boy who used to climb into my lap with scraped knees and stories from school. I thought about the young man who had turned his back because I couldn't hand him money I didn't have. And I thought about the man I would soon face after 25 years of silence. Was he still my son in his heart? Or was I just an old woman he remembered once he heard I had money? I didn't know the answer, but I knew I was finally ready to find out. On Christmas Eve morning, I loaded my bag into the trunk of my car. The cold air stung my cheeks, but I didn't mind. I fastened my coat, slid into the driver's seat, and took a deep breath. The road ahead wasn't long in miles, but it stretched over decades of hurt. As I pulled away from my house, I told myself, whatever happens, at least the silence will finally end. The drive to Wesley's house was quiet. Snow lined the streets, and holiday lights glowed from porches as I passed. Each mile brought a mix of nerves and resolve. By the time I turned into his neighborhood, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. Wesley lived in a large suburban home, 2 stories with brick and siding, the kind you see in family magazines. Cars filled the driveway and spilled into the street. I parked a little ways down and walked up with my bag and gifts in hand. When I rang the bell, it was Lillian who opened the door. She smiled, but her eyes didn't match. "Dorothy, it's been a long time," she said. "Yes, it has," I answered, stepping inside. The house smelled of ham and cinnamon, and the sound of children laughing echoed from the living room. But the warmth I expected to feel wasn't there. Everything felt stiff, like a stage play, where the actors hadn't rehearsed enough. Wesley came out from the kitchen. For a moment, my breath caught. He looked older, of course, with lines around his eyes and a little gray at his temples. But in his face, I still saw the boy I had raised. "Mom," he said, pulling me into a quick hug. "Glad you came." I hugged him back, though it was awkward. 25 years can't be erased with one word. The grandchildren were introduced one by one. They were polite, each shaking my hand and thanking me for the gifts I'd brought. But they didn't know me, and I couldn't blame them for the distance in their voices. I was a stranger who happened to share their last name. Dinner was set in the dining room. The table was decorated beautifully, with candles and fine china. Lillian had prepared a full spread: ham, potatoes, vegetables, rolls, and pies lined up on the counter. We bowed our heads for grace, and I joined quietly. I kept waiting for a moment when I would feel like part of the family again, but instead I felt like a guest who didn't quite belong. The meal began with small talk. The grandchildren spoke about school, sports, and plans with friends. I listened carefully, soaking up every detail because I had missed so much of their lives. Then came Lillian's first remark. "So, Dorothy," she said, cutting into her ham, "we heard you've had quite the success with your businesses. Storage units, isn't it? Who would have thought? You must be very comfortable these days." Her tone was sweet on the surface, but the words felt heavy. I gave a small smile. "I've kept myself busy," I said. "I'm grateful for the stability it's given me." She nodded, but I could see she was fishing. The rest of the meal continued in much the same way. Wesley asked polite questions about my house, my health, and whether I still attended the same church. But sprinkled in were comments about rising costs, difficult times, and how unpredictable the economy had become. I answered what I could without offering more than necessary. Inside, my suspicion grew stronger. This wasn't about reconciling. This was about testing the ground, seeing how much I might give. After dessert was served, Wesley stood up with his glass of wine. He tapped it gently with a spoon, drawing everyone's attention. "I just want to say how good it is to have family together again," he began. "We've missed out on too much time, and tonight feels like a fresh start." There were nods around the table, but my chest tightened. His words sounded good, but something in his voice felt rehearsed. Then he shifted. "As most of you know," he continued, glancing at Lillian, "the past few years have been tough. Running a business isn't easy. We've had setbacks, and there are bills we're struggling to keep up with." He sighed deeply, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. "But family is what helps us through, and having Mom here tonight reminds me that we can lean on one another when times are hard." The room was quiet for a moment. My fork rested on my plate. It was clear now. This invitation wasn't about rebuilding love or reconnecting after years of silence. It was about money. My money. I felt the sting in my chest, but I held my face steady. I had prepared for this possibility. I thought of the manila folder in my bag, tucked away, waiting if I needed it. I looked at Wesley, my son who once sat at my kitchen table with scraped knees, and Homework, the boy I had raised on my own. Now he was standing there, hinting that I was his solution to financial troubles. My heart sank, but my resolve hardened. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to notice. Lillian shifted in her seat, glancing between us, waiting to see how I would respond. Finally, I said, "It has been a long time, and I'm glad to see everyone gathered together. But I came here tonight to reconnect, not to talk about business or money." The words hung in the air. A few of the grandchildren looked down at their plates. Lillian forced a smile, but her eyes darted toward Wesley. He gave a short nod, as if he'd expected me to resist, but wasn't finished pushing. After coffee was poured, conversation tried to move on, but the tension lingered. I smiled where I could, listened to the children, and shared a few stories about Wesley when he was their age. Those were the only genuine moments of the night. But inside, I knew the truth. The reason I had been invited wasn't because of love. It wasn't because they missed me. It was because they had heard I had money, and that realization hurt more than the 25 years of silence ever did. Imagine waiting 25 years to hear from your child, only to find out it was about money. Would that break you or make you stronger? Subscribe if you believe no parent should be used like this. And if you wouldn't subscribe, at least tell me why in the comments, because I want to hear every reason. After coffee was cleared away, the grandchildren drifted into the living room to play a board game. Lillian busied herself in the kitchen, stacking plates and wiping down counters. that left Wesley and me sitting across from each other at the long dining table. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and looked straight at me. His tone changed. The polite small talk was gone. "Mom," he said slowly, "I'm just going to be honest. We're in trouble. The restaurant hasn't done well these past few years. Between the economy and rising costs, we're falling behind. If something doesn't change, we could lose it all." I listened without interrupting. He went on, his voice low but steady. "We need help. A loan, just something to get us through until things turn around. You've done well for yourself. I know you can afford it." There it was, the words I had expected all along. For a moment, I stared at my son. I thought about the years I had spent working double shifts at the post office to keep food on the table. I thought about going to night school when I was exhausted, saving penny after penny to build the life I now had. And I thought about the 25 years he had chosen silence, only to open his door now because he needed money. My heart hurt, but I kept my face calm. I reached down, opened my bag, and slid out the sealed manila folder. I placed it carefully on the table between us. "What's that?" Wesley asked, frowning. I didn't answer right away. I took my time opening the flap and spreading out the papers inside. Deeds, loan statements, contracts, copies of property transfers. His eyes scanned the words, and confusion turned into shock. Finally, I spoke. My voice was steady, almost quiet. "I heard through some old friends that your restaurant was in trouble. So a few weeks ago, I did some checking. And Wesley, I didn't just come here tonight with gifts. I came prepared." I tapped the paper with my finger. "This right here is the mortgage on your restaurant. I bought it." For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the clock ticking on the wall. Then Lillian walked back in, holding a dish towel, and froze. "You what?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I bought your debt," I repeated calmly. "The bank was more than willing to sell. I now hold the mortgage, which means if payments aren't made, I'm the one who decides what happens next." The color drained from both their faces. "You didn't invite me here for family," I said. "You invited me here for money, and I knew that before I walked through your door." Wesley's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked like a boy caught in a lie, only he was a grown man sitting across from his mother. One of the grandchildren peeked into the dining room, sensing the tension. I gave a small smile and told them gently to go back and finish their game. I wasn't about to let this turn into a shouting match in front of the children. Lillian finally spoke, her voice rising. "How could you do this without telling us? That's cruel." I shook my head. "No, Lillian. What's cruel is ignoring your own mother for 25 years, then only reaching out when you smell money. What's cruel is pretending tonight was about family when it was really about saving your business. I didn't create this situation. You did." I leaned back in my chair. My voice never rose. I didn't need to yell. The papers in front of me said everything. Wesley rubbed his temples, trying to take it in. "So what are you saying? You're going to take the restaurant from us?" I folded my hands. "I'm saying you now answer to me. I came prepared because I knew this night wasn't about love. It was about what you thought you could get from me. Well, you can't get it by guilt or by hinting. If you want to keep that restaurant, you'll do it under terms that are honest and clear. No more lies. No more pretending." The room went silent again. The weight of it hung heavy. I gathered the papers back into the folder and closed it. I didn't drive all this way to play games. You wanted my money. What you got instead was the truth. And the truth is this: I'm not a bank you can sweet talk, and I'm not a fool you can push around. I'm your mother, whether you've treated me like it or not. And I came here tonight to show you that I can't be used. Lillian's eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. Wesley stared at the folder as though it were a live wire. Finally, I stood up. I think that's enough for tonight. I'll head to the guest room. Tomorrow, after the children open their gifts, we'll talk more about where things go from here. I left the dining room without waiting for a reply. My bag, with the folder back inside, felt heavier than when I had arrived. As I closed the door behind me in the guest room, I sat down on the bed and let out a long breath. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't begged. I had simply laid out the truth. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt in control. The next morning, Christmas Day, the house was filled with the sound of children unwrapping gifts. Laughter bounced off the walls, paper was torn, and little voices shouted with joy. I sat in the living room chair, watching each of them open the packages I had brought. They thanked me politely, but I could see their curiosity too. They didn't know me, not really. They only knew I was the grandmother who had never been around. Still, they smiled and showed me their gifts, and for a few short minutes I felt like I belonged. But once the wrapping paper was cleared and the excitement settled, the weight of the night before returned. Wesley caught my eye and gave a small nod. We both knew it was time to talk. We sat down at the dining table again, this time with Lillian present. The grandchildren stayed nearby in the living room, quiet but listening. Children notice more than we think. I placed the manila folder back on the table. Before anything else, I began, I want you both to understand something. I didn't come here to destroy you, and I didn't come for revenge. I came because I wanted clarity. For 25 years, you chose silence. And now you've chosen to reach out because of money. I won't pretend that doesn't hurt, but I refuse to let this moment pass without truth. They didn't speak. Lillian folded her arms, while Wesley stared down at his hands. I opened the folder again and pulled out 2 sheets of paper. You have 2 options, I said. Option 1, I enforce foreclosure. That means I take the property from you, the same way a bank would. You'll walk away with nothing. The business will be over. That choice is simple, but it's final. I paused, letting the words sink in. The room was so still I could hear the clock ticking again. Option 2, I continued, is harder, but fair. You hand over management to me. I'll set the terms. You'll work under those terms until the debt is paid back, slowly and honestly. You'll earn your way out instead of looking for a handout. Lillian shifted uncomfortably, her face tight. You'd really take control of our restaurant. That's humiliating. I met her eyes. No, it's accountability. You asked for help. This is help with boundaries. You won't lose everything, but you also won't have the freedom to run things recklessly. You'll work, and you'll prove yourselves. Wesley leaned forward, his voice low. So you don't everything we've built? I shook my head. I already own the mortgage. That isn't a threat. It's a fact. The choice you have is whether I shut it down or whether I let you keep working under me until the debt is gone. Think of it as a second chance, one you wouldn't have if the bank still held the papers. The grandchildren had grown quieter in the other room, listening closely now. I glanced toward them and softened my tone. I want you to understand something, Wesley, I said. When you walked away from me years ago, you chose pride over family. You chose money over love. I can't erase that. But right here, right now, you have a chance to make a different choice. This isn't about revenge. This is about truth. And truth always demands honesty over pride. For the first time since I arrived, Wesley's face shifted. I saw a flash of the boy I once knew, torn between shame and stubbornness. I thought you'd just help us, he admitted quietly. I didn't expect this. I know you didn't. I replied. But help without accountability isn't help, it's enabling. You've asked me for a loan. I'm giving you something better. the opportunity to prove you can be responsible, and the safety net of knowing your children won't lose everything overnight. Lillian's jaw tightened. And if we say no, then I file foreclosure. I said simply, and the restaurant is gone within months. It's that plain. Silence stretched. The weight of the decision pressed down on all of us. One of the grandchildren, a girl about 12, walked slowly into the dining room. She looked from her father to me. "Grandma," she asked softly, "does this mean we won't lose our house?" Her question cut through everything. I leaned down, so I was eye level with her. "Sweetheart, no one is taking your house. This is only about the restaurant. You'll be safe." She nodded, her eyes wide, and went back to the living room. The innocence in her voice made my heart ache. This wasn't her fault. None of the children had asked for this. I turned back to Wesley and Lillian. "This is the line," I said. "No more pretending. No more calling it family when it's really about money. If you want to rebuild a relationship with me, it won't be through guilt or requests. It will be through honesty. And if you want to save your business, you'll do it by working under the conditions I've set." I closed the folder, slid it toward them, and folded my hands. "The decision is yours." Neither of them spoke right away. Wesley stared at the papers, while Lillian's lips pressed thin. The silence dragged, heavy but necessary. Finally, Wesley whispered, "We'll do it. We'll work under you." Lillian shot him a sharp look, but he didn't back down. "It's better than losing everything." I nodded slowly. "Then that's settled. We'll put it in writing. You'll work, you'll repay, and you'll earn back your freedom the right way. And maybe, if there's honesty this time, you'll earn back more than that." The grandchildren peeked back into the dining room again. They didn't understand all the details, but they knew something serious had just happened. They stood quietly watching. In that moment, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The past couldn't be undone, but at least the truth was finally on the table. Justice had been served, not through cruelty, but through boundaries. And for the first time in decades, I felt like the silence between us had been broken by something real. A week after Christmas, I drove into town to meet Wesley and Lillian at the restaurant. The holiday decorations were still up, garland hanging across the windows, a small tree in the corner, but the place felt tired. Tables were scratched, the chairs wobbled, and only a couple of customers sat scattered in the dining room. I had been preparing for this visit since the night I laid out their two choices. They had agreed to work under me, and now it was time to set the rules. We sat at a booth near the back. I opened a notebook and slid it across the table. "This is how it's going to work," I said. They leaned in, listening, though I could see the reluctance on Lillian's face. "You'll stay on as managers, but every expense over a set amount comes through me. No more gambling on flashy menus or renovations you can't afford. Staff will be paid first, suppliers second, and debt reduction third. That's the order. You'll both draw modest salaries, enough to live on, but not enough to dig a deeper hole. Every month you'll meet me with the books in hand." Wesley nodded slowly. "And when the debt is paid off, then it's yours again," I answered. "But until then, this restaurant belongs to me." They both signed the agreement. It wasn't easy for them, but it was clear they didn't have a better option. Over the next few weeks, I made regular visits. I walked the kitchen, looked at invoices, and met the staff. Some of the younger waitresses seemed surprised that a gray-haired woman was the new owner, but they quickly realized I was fair. I didn't demand perfection, but I demanded honesty. I cut out waste, renegotiated supply contracts, and tightened schedules. It wasn't glamorous work, but it started to make a difference. Slowly, the numbers turned around. For Wesley and Lillian, the hardest part was swallowing their pride. They were used to running things their way. Now, they had to answer to me, but every time they looked like they might slip back into old habits, I reminded them, "You asked for help. This is what it looks like." The grandchildren started to see me differently during those weeks. One afternoon, the same 12-year-old girl who had asked about their house came to me quietly. "Grandma," she said, "thank you for not giving up on us. I know my parents can be difficult, but I'm glad you're here." Her words went straight to my heart. It was the first real crack in the wall between us. For all the pain of the past, that small moment reminded me why I hadn't just walked away. Another grandson asked me one evening to tell him stories about Wesley as a boy. I pulled out the photo album I brought and showed him pictures. Wesley riding his bike, Wesley in his baseball uniform, Wesley holding a fishing pole. The boy laughed and shook his head. Hard to imagine Dad was ever that small. Bit by bit, the grandchildren started reaching out. They didn't carry the same bitterness their parents did, and that gave me hope. Still, I never fooled myself. The 25 years I lost with Wesley were gone. Nothing could give me back the birthdays, the graduations, or the countless phone calls that never came. That grief would always be with me, but there was peace too. For the first time, I had faced the truth instead of hiding from it. I hadn't come to Christmas with anger, and I hadn't left with shame. I had stood firm. I had balanced accountability with dignity, and because of that, I felt lighter. One evening, after finishing the books at the restaurant, I locked up and stood outside in the cool night air. The neon sign buzzed above me, and cars rolled by on the street. I thought about everything that had happened: the silence, the letter, the confrontation at Christmas, the choices made since. I whispered to myself, family isn't built on money. It's built on truth. And sometimes the only way to heal is to stop financing the lie. That line settled in my chest like a stone, but not a heavy one, a solid one. The new year came. I spent it at home with a pot of soup simmering on the stove and a quiet prayer of thanks for strength. Life didn't look like the picture I once imagined, but it was life I could live with honestly and without fear. Now, looking back, I ask myself, did I do the right thing? I believe I did. I didn't hand out money blindly, and I didn't let bitterness win. I set boundaries. I protected the grandchildren from losing everything, and I walked away with my dignity intact. But I'll ask you the same questions I've asked myself. What would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have walked away for good, or would you have stayed and set the rules? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If my story touched you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. Your comments matter more than you know. I read every one. Thank you for listening.